All right, so it looks like the logins have slowed down, so thank you everyone who has dialed in for your patience. We'll go ahead and get started. As I mentioned earlier, today's presentation is relatively short. It should only take about 20 minutes to half an hour, and I will be breaking the presentation in halves. So we are going to cover LDMS end user validation and audit readiness. So the first part will be discussing the validation process as well as the laboratory's role in validating the LDMS software. And then in the second half, we will be covering information that is available both within LDMS and from Frontier Science to prepare for audit readiness. So currently, everyone is muted. When we have that break in the middle, I will unmute everyone's phone. So if you can please be conscious of any background noise, or you can always unmute yourself as well when we have a question and answer session. When you logged in, you should have been notified that this conference is being recorded, but please take this as a reminder that we are recording the meeting. So let's start with a brief description of software validation. So software validation is the process of checking that the software product satisfies its intended use and is functioning as it was intended to. Now, Frontier Science, as the vendor for LDMS, performs validation as part of our software development lifecycle. The end user should perform validation to confirm that the software is functioning in its final environment, in the end user's environment. Now, each process requires significant documentation, and this records the process, the results, and evaluation of that software. So this entire process is born from 21 CFR Part 11, Subpart 10A, the validation of systems to ensure accuracy, reliability, consistent intended performance, and the ability to discern invalid or altered records. The FDA has provided further guidance on that testing at the user site is an essential part of software validation. It should take place at the user site with the actual hardware and software that's part of the installed system configuration. Now, testing is accomplished through actual or simulated use of the software being tested within the context in which it's intended to function, and that the user site testing should follow a predefined written plan that includes a formal summary of testing and a record of acceptance. So here's an example of some SOPs that your lab should have in place pertaining to the LDMS. Data backup and recovery, alternative recording methods in case the LDMS is unavailable, computer user training, access and user accounts, system setup and installation, and that document is available on the FISTRIC portal as well as the LDMS website. The system operating manual, which is freely available on the LDMS website, and validation and functionality testing. Now, some of these SOPs also will cover the 21 CFR Part 11 gap analysis, such as data backup and recovery and alternative recording methods, as well as the access and user accounts. Not everything is covered within the validation and functionality testing documentation. And let's get into that right now. So for the end user validation documentation, this process is independent of the developer. The documents need to be developed and maintained by each lab. So if requested, we can always provide our suite of documentation that's part of developing the LDMS. And as a benefit to our laboratories, we have created a sample SOP and some templates for the end user validation documentation. And that is also available through our website, and I will discuss that at the end of the presentation. Now, this process does not only apply to the LDMS. So labs need to do a risk analysis and determine which software and what level of validation needs to be documented. And so if you already have this process in place for other software or possibly analyzers at your laboratory. You can apply that process then to the LDMS. Now, the documentation may be less than if you were to apply it to, in this, let's say, take an analyzer, for example, that's used on a regulatory study. So the suite of documents may be smaller, but that same process can be applied. You don't have to use the templates that we have created. So first, the SOP on validation and functionality testing. So this will document the procedure of performing and validating the software. You create a validation team to perform all the tasks. You perform a risk assessment to determine the steps and the documentation required. So the content of the validation documents is described in our templates that we provide. We have a validation plan, our user specifications and requirements, the installation qualification, and that is the installation report that's available on the LDMS website, our testing plan and testing report, and the system release plan. Now, all of these documents are then stored as essential documents, and they must be maintained then for every version of LDMS that is in use at your laboratory. So let's go through some of these templates. So we have our validation plan. Now that lists the validation team members and initial risk assessment. So the risk assessment, you're looking at the different tasks performed by that software and then determining what risk is associated with that task and any ways of mitigating that risk. So an example would be in storage. The LDMS is used to assign that virtual storage location. Well, what is a risk associated with that user requirement? The risk could be that the specimen is not stored in the same location that is recorded in the LDMS. Well, how do you mitigate that risk? Well, utilizing the barcode, you can always QA your box by utilizing the reports that are available within the LDMS. And so that's an example of a risk assessment. The validation plan will list all the specific validation activities and list the deliverables, so the other documents that are part of that plan. Now, the user specifications and requirements. So this will list all of the user requirements and can be based on inputs from anticipated users, IT. If you're part of vendor selection process, this can be also based on an RFP. So an example of a user requirement, the LDMS will, or the software will accession specimens. The software will allow for the virtual storage of specimens and the management of a biorepository. Okay, so there is a little bit of background noise. If you can just check to make sure you're muted. Let me see. Fantastic. So those, the software will facilitate shipment of specimens between laboratories. Again, those are all user requirements. The last template we have on this slide, our IQ, the installation qualification, records that the installation configuration is all documented. You can also document your backup procedures. Our validation templates continue. And again, these are templates that you can request from Frontier Science in case you do not have these already in place at your laboratory. So our testing plans, we have our test cases. And every test case is looking at the functions of the software and has their associated expected results. Now, the test cases should cover multiple scenarios, and that way you can ensure that all of the functions within the software are performing as intended. So in the center here, we have our test report. Now, this has a list of the test cases and the actual results. So what occurred while you were performing the test cases? Any resolutions if the actual results do not meet the expected results from the testing plan, and then an evaluation. Now, all that is then wrapped up into the system release plan, which is the plan of to place the software into production. Now, this can also include the validation report that records the successful validation of the program, that you had your testing plan that listed all of your expected results that match your user requirements, your testing report that all your test cases were successfully run. You have your installation in there as well, and that's all wrapped up into that system release plan. So let's talk a little bit more about our test cases. This is the bulk of that documentation. So we have a list of our test cases and their expected results. We have the test results evaluation. So does that test pass or fail? The evaluation, so in resolution, so any resolution for a failed test, and then the test report records everything: the test case itself, the expected reports, the expected results, the actual results, and then any resolutions for those discrepancies between the expected and the actual. So further discussion on our test case, we have an example here. So after adding a new processing date and time in specimen management, we go to the reports module, run the specimen processing report, pull in search criteria that will bring that specimen into the report, such as the PID and specimen date. And then the expected result is that the processing date that we placed in specimen management is the same one that is on our report. And we will run that. The actual result will either be a screen capture of specimen management in the report. We can pull the report in as an artifact of that test, and then if they match, the test passes. A test case, example 2, after importing the LDMS shipping file, we create a shipping manifest in our LDMS, and then we compare the document from our LDMS to the one from the sending lab. And the expected result is that each document is the same. Each document matches. And again, you can pull in a copy of both of those manifests as an artifact of that test. And then if they are the same, the test will pass. So that ends our discussion on end user validation. As I mentioned, we do provide templates for our laboratories to help document these tasks and document each process of the validation. If you have this in place already within your institution, within your laboratory, just take that process and apply it to the LDMS. And you do not have to use the templates that we have created, but we have done so as a service to our laboratories, and you can request that through the LDMS website, and we'll be discussing that at the very end of the presentation. Okay, so before moving on into the information that's available within the LDMS and from Frontier Science in preparation for audits, we were discussing version 13.0 of Windows, but we should also discuss implementation of this process for web as well. So being a web laboratory does not exonerate you from this process. You still need to go through the validation process and test your database, and then the only difference will be some of the gap analysis. So the backup and export, that process no longer occurs, so you can remove that from that gap analysis. Also, your user accounts are now curated by Frontier Science when you're a web lab, and so that is also removed. The installation, your IQ, is no longer applicable because we perform the installation of the web LDMS software. So there is a little bit of difference between our web and our Windows process, but it still needs to be performed. So continuing on, let's discuss some reports that are available within the LDMS for audit support. So in this first slide, we're going to discuss some reports that are within the reports category. Now, these are those predefined reports that are coded within the LDMS. We have our specimen log report, which is available in the specimen category. So it provides the user with a list of all specimens the lab has logged into your LDMS. Now, the list is organized by primary, and then it will show the aliquots associated with that primary. Our storage detail report will give a detailed summary of the specimen and the exact location of it within your virtual storage. And the user permissions report will list all of the current users in the LDMS and also a list of their access within the different modules. Next is our transaction log. So this transaction log is available already in web and is only available in Windows from 13.0 and higher in Windows LDMS. So at the very top, we see that this fulfills 21 CFR Part 11, Subpart 10E, to use a secure, computer-generated and time-stamped audit trail. Now, this log is a historical record of all of your transactions performed in your LDMS database. The log is located in the Reports module under the Admin category. You can put in search criteria to limit the report either by a user or date range, and we recommend you generate it as a CSV file, and that way you can utilize Excel to sort and also search within the transaction log. So in our next screen here, we see a screen cap of the transaction log. Now, moving from left to right, we can see our user, the date and time, so that time stamped, the transaction type, the old data, and then the new data that was in place. Over to the right, we see our LDMS transaction ID. So if we take that first line of the log, we see that the processing tech initials were updated to AL for this global specimen ID. So when you have this transaction log, the global specimen ID is a way of searching to see what actions were performed on that individual specimen. The transaction ID that's over to the right is a unique serial number that is placed onto each entry of the transaction log. Now, we were discussing Windows and our web lab. So if you are your transaction log actually restarts for your web database. So that is not something that comes over and is then in place in your web database when you migrate from Windows to web. So always, so keep that in mind if you are a lab that has changed platforms. So our data retrieval and our custom report builder module. Data retrieval in Windows, it's known as custom report builder in web. Now the utility can construct a customized report using a large variety of data fields. Now the data fields, since there are so many, are separated out by categories such as specimen, storage, and shipping. And then you will take those data fields and you list them in the column to construct your customized report, and they can be, again, generated as a CSV or tab delimited file that then can be imported into Excel. So outside of the LDMS, we have further information for audit support available from the LDMS website. So for our Windows laboratory, we have our installation reports. This is available on the LDMS website under Get LDMS, and then the Download LDMS for Windows page. Now this is part of that validation plan. This is the IQ. And what the report has, we see it has several tasks and functions listed, and their laboratory is requested to verify after the installation of the software. They then initial and they return a signed copy of this report to our user support department where we maintain it. So if you do not have a process in place for validation at your laboratory, you can go to the LDMS website, go to that resources tab, click on validation. You can complete the form. You can request our documents, the vendor documents for the LDMS, and also you can request those templates that we described. Once you make your submission, Frontier Science will follow up with an access code. You return to the validation page and then place that access code in there, and then your suite of documents will be available. Now, our last tab there, our vendor documentation is always readily available, but the end user validation, that documentation that we provide is for guidance purposes. And again, if you have a process in place at your laboratory, it is better to then apply that process to the LDMS rather than try to utilize the documents that we've created. But those documents need to be in place well in advance of an audit. So if you know an audit is occurring and you don't have this in place, it is a little bit too late. So you need to have this process ready. And if you have an audit scheduled, we are your resource. So if you're in the middle of an audit, if you know an audit is coming and you're not quite sure where to get information within your LDMS, contact our user support department. They'll be your first contact. They may loop our department in to discuss, but don't feel that you have to go it alone. You always have us through phone, email, or there's that contact us page on the LDMS website.